Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name's Kaylee and these are my books. For today's video, I will be talking about my all-time favorite fantasy books as of March 2023. Almost forgot what month it was for a second. But this video is in honor of Realmathon because I am a co-host of Team Fantasy. I'll leave Cassidy's announcement video for Realmathon in the description box below. But basically, whether or not you're participating in Realmathon, I hope this video helps you out with some great fantasy book recs because I'm going to be talking about the best of the best, in my opinion. So I will be talking about my top 10 favorite fantasy books / series in this video, and they're in no particular order. It was way too hard to put these in a specific order. So I'm just going to start out with something random, but again, this is not my 10th spot book. This is just one of the 10 favorites, okay? Okay. So first book to talk about is Red Sister by Mark Lawrence. I read this book somewhat recently, so I haven't yet continued on with the series, but even just the first book was enough to make it onto this list because, oh my goodness, this book was so cool. This is a book about assassin nuns, and we follow our main character, Nona, who is about to be executed for possibly murdering somebody. It's a bit murky on if she actually did it or not, but these nuns see some potential in her, so they take her away from the execution block and put her in this magical assassin school, which is so freaking cool. I love school settings in fantasy books. It's one of my favorite things to read about, and this not only has a school setting, but it also has like the cool training setting too, and the magic system was really fun to read about. And this book is the winner for the best first sentence in a book ever of all time, and I'm about to read you that first sentence. It is important when killing a nun to ensure that you bring an army of sufficient size. What? That is so cool. And just as a little bonus, I'll read you the second sentence. For Sister Thorn of the Sweet Mercy Convent, Lanotassus brought 200 men. These nuns are badass. And this character is just such a good character to read about. This is a book that had so much fun going on in the plot. So many interesting things that were uncovered about the magic system, about the politics of the world, even when we were fairly localized in the school setting. But then also just the character work. I loved reading about Nona. And I think from what I know about the rest of the series is Nona grows up throughout the other books. So we're really just following her along with her life. Because you can see on the cover, it shows kind of a grown woman, and at least that's how I'm interpreting her to be. But in this book, Nona is quite young. She is fully a child. I believe she starts as like 9 and ages up a little bit in this book, but not enough to be like a grown adult. And I loved this book so much. I really need to continue on in the series, but there's too many books, too little time, you know. But this is definitely a book series that I want to complete before the end of this year. Next up, one of my favorite fantasy books of all time is The Sword of Kaigen. This book took me by surprise. This book is just incredible. I mean, all of these books are incredible. This book is a standalone. I think technically there is a prequel series about this book, but I haven't read it. This totally works as a standalone. And to my knowledge, there are no like direct sequels, but there are other books set in this world. Sword of Kaigen is a self-published fantasy book that follows the Matsuda family. And the Matsuda family is part of the Kaigenese Empire's like very much elite army, and there is elemental magic in this series. And so this series, there's a lot of magic that has to do with ice and wind and stuff like that. And it's just so cool. And we follow a couple different characters in this family. We follow the mother, we follow the son, we follow the father for a bit, and each character's exploration is one of the most stunning character arcs that I've ever seen, particularly the mother, as we also get flashbacks of the mother from when she was a child before the family, and then after when she is a mother in the family. And so the plot premise is basically there are these elite warriors for this empire, but they're kind of like people of the old ways, people of the old times. The world is moving on from individual warriors and moving into times of technology and quote-unquote progress. And so the empire is under attack from these other countries that no longer rely on these individual type of warriors. And it's just about them trying to maintain hold on their family while fighting for their empire, but then also realizing that they're potentially being manipulated by the empire to see how the world really looks around them. The little quote here I think gives you a good vibe of the series. Better to die sharp in war than rest through a time of peace. And it's just the exploration of motherhood, the exploration of a country's propaganda, the dynamic between old ways versus new ways, outsiders moving into this fairly isolated country-ish village and bringing these new ideas, these new ideologies, challenging the tradition. It's just, this book is so smart. And the structure of this fantasy book is, I had never seen it done before reading this book. There's something that happens halfway through that shocked me to my core. I was like, how do we still have half of the book left? Like, what is going to happen now? How can this author have done this? I was shocked in the best way possible because it felt like I was reading something brand new and so fresh and just so creative. And the motherhood, the challenging life between individuality and being a mother and being one unit of this family and maintaining your individuality while also owing part of your life to your children and your husband and vice versa. And then even just the exploration of marriage and the complications between partnership and maintaining individuality in that partnership. The discussions and conversations that happen in this book were so well done, in my opinion, just so well done. And it actually challenged some of my beliefs too. Like, I went in with some bias in what I would prefer and what I think is correct, and this book challenged me. This book made me see more nuance in certain situations that I wouldn't normally have seen. And I think that's a good way to talk about the conversations in this book. They're just so incredibly nuanced. And the magic system is really, really cool. On the back, there is a little blurb that says it's the Poppy Wars darkness meets the Last Airbender's elemental magic. I completely agree with that, and I think that's a great way to describe this book. The writing is a bit dense because it's doing so much, and it did take me a little bit to get into this book. I wasn't hooked right at the beginning, so give yourself some time because I think it's really rewarding if you give yourself time to get immersed in the story. I listened to the audiobook for this when I was reading it for the first time, and I thought the audiobook was really well done, so if you're interested and you like audiobooks, check it out. But like I said, give yourself a bit of time before you decide that this book isn't for you, because I wasn't immediately sold, and I gave it the time, and now it's one of my favorite books that I've ever read before. Next up is probably no surprise to anyone. It's Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn. Check out this cool new cover and very, very floppy paperback I got. I'm very happy with getting this new edition. The Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series was life-changing for me. And I know that sounds dramatic, and possibly I am being quite dramatic, but this is the series that made me realize that I can move from only reading YA fantasy to exploring the adult fantasy genre. So this was the bridge between the two for me. This is the series that made me love adult fantasy, made me explore adult fantasy, made me not be intimidated by adult fantasy, and here I am today loving adult fantasy. It's probably my top genre of all time. So this, I credit that love to this book, and I've read this book 3 times now. I really am wanting to do a reread of this series in April. I don't know if I'll have time for it, but Mistborn Era 1, Mistborn Era 2, it's so good. Era 1 is what is on this list, so this book is kind of a placeholder for the entire Era 1 trilogy. Mistborn is set in a world where the hero failed and the villain won, and it's been 1,000 years in this world where the villain has been ruling the empire, and it's a terrible place, terrible place. And we get this ragtag group of together, and it kind of works similar to a heist group where they decide they're gonna run the biggest heist that they can think of, and they are going to kill the immortal empire. They're going to kill the immortal emperor that has been ruling for 1,000 years. And this book just has such strong found family themes. It makes you root for these underdogs so much. And the magic system is my favorite magic system I've ever read about. It's a magic system based on metal, and you ingest certain metals, and you're able to manipulate those metals into giving you powers. Each metal has a different power, and most people, well, a lot of people can't do any metal manipulation, but some people can manipulate one metal. But there are these very special people called Mistborn who can manipulate all the metals and get access to all of the powers. And just so happens there is a teenager who lives on the streets, and she is really just not having a great life. She's begging every day for scraps of food, but she discovers that she is a Mistborn, and she joins this ragtag group of people, and she teams up with a criminal mastermind called Kelsier, and together they decide that they're going to take down the Emperor. I love this series so much. This is, if I said there's no order to this list, but this is at the top. This is my #1 favorite fantasy series of all time. It's just amazing. It's so good, and I can never thank it enough for how much it changed my view of the fantasy genre. Next up is Ashes of the Sun. This is another stand-in for the entire series, except I've only read the first 2 books. The third book I haven't gotten a chance to read yet, but the first 2 books are awesome, and the series is so fun. So this is another adult fantasy series. Rachel describes it as gay fantasy Star Wars, and I think that's a great way to describe this series. This is a series where we follow Maya and Geyer, and they are brother and sister, but when Maya is 5, the Empire kind of discovers that she has magical abilities. And if you have magical abilities, you're recruited to be kind of like the Empire's version of police. Think like stormtrooper type of people. And so she gets kidnapped away from the family. And so she is raised up in the Empire school systems and trained up to be this like magical police officer essentially. And so she believes the Empire's ideology. Meanwhile, Geyer, her brother, has been raised in this poor family who watched their daughter and sister be kidnapped away from them, from the Empire, and so he has grown up hating the Empire, and he is now a notorious rebel and fighting against the Empire. And it's just about these 2 siblings fighting for what they believe in and possibly reuniting and realizing that they're on opposite sides of the battlefield. This is a book where a rebellion is brewing, and it's going to have an explosive conclusion. The tension between these siblings possibly meeting, possibly not meeting, many times throughout the book was so fun. And the characters are one of the best parts of this book. There is romance in here, there are friendships in here, there's found family in here. The plot is so exciting, the magic is very intriguing. There are many mysteries in this book that I was flipping the pages to see how they are going to be resolved by the end. I think this book is really approachable too. I recommend this book fairly widely, even if you don't typically read fantasy. But even if you do typically read fantasy, you gotta read this book. You're gonna love it. It's so fun. Next up is Crescent City, House of Earth and Blood. I love this series. I love Sarah J. Maas. I think her books are really fun, and they always give me the feels. And this book, it gives me the feels every time I read it. I've read this book 3 times. Every single time I've bawled crying, and this is my favorite series by Sarah J. Maas, and I believe it's the most fantasy forward of her series as well, so I put it on this list. Although there is some romance in it, I do believe it has enough of a fantasy plot to belong on a fantasy book list. And this is an urban fantasy where we follow our main character Bryce, who has gone through quite a lot of trauma at the beginning of the book and is grieving and is very self-destructive. And she has to team up with Hunt, who is this like detective type of character, but of really high standing in the society, to figure out who or what has killed her friends. And it's just about her overcoming her grief, overcoming her trauma, and also going on this murder mystery plot. But this is an urban fantasy world, so there are tons of different magical beings and creatures in this story. There are fae, there are angels, there are merfolk, there are like blanking nymphs and centaurs, and like there's so many different things in here. And basically this is a city environment too, which I think is really cool to read about because I haven't read many fantasy worlds where there's also city environments. There's also humans in here, but it definitely is urban fantasy. Like, it's set in a world with cell phones and ballet theaters and humans and colleges and all that kind of thing. But it's not like it's set in Chicago, is basically what I'm saying. Like, it's its own little fantasy city, but set in our world. And I think the characters in this are just so well done. I think the murder mystery is really intriguing. I love the magic system in here. I love Bryce as a character. Bryce is one of my favorite fantasy characters of all time. I just really, really care about her, and reading her story time and time again and seeing the growth that happens, and then the backtracking, and then the growth, and then the character arcs and development, and the friendships she makes and the friendships she loses. It's just such a beautiful book, in my opinion. Next up is The Ruin of Kings. I read this book super recently. I haven't had a chance yet to read the rest of the series, but I am planning on binge reading the whole rest of the series in April for Realmathon. And there's actually a buddy read Discord server that I created because there's a lot of us on Team Enya that are wanting to binge read the Chorus of Dragons series. I'll leave that Discord link in the description box below just in case you would also like to join our buddy read. But this book is so good. It's just so fun. I knew from the first like 25 pages, I was like, oh, so this is gonna be a new all-time favorite. Cool. So this is a book where we follow Kieran, who is a street urchin type of character. He lives in a brothel to play music for them, and he's very poor, and then suddenly some demons attack, and he encounters people of the nobility, and they realize that he is a long-lost heir to a noble bloodline. And so he gets picked up from the streets and thrown into this noble, high-class society, and it seems like there is a prophecy that he fits the characteristics for. However, this is not a typical chosen one prophecy. This is a prophecy that he may be the person to destroy the world. And this structure of this book is so unique, in my opinion, because it's told in two different point of views, but following Kieran the whole way through. And one point of view is him telling his own story, and from like earlier on, and then one point of view is someone else telling his story when he's a little bit older. And there's also footnotes throughout this book of a third person making their own interjections along the way. And I just love how much of the actual storytelling craft is like woven into the story in such a meta way. It really worked for me. It really worked of how we have a future Kieran telling his own story from the past. I just thought it was so engaging, and this plot is wild. This is so fast paced, and we go on so many twists and turns, and I was not bored for a single second of this book. Like, it is constantly throwing crazy stuff at you, but in a way that it feels approachable to read. Like, I was never confused by any of the wild things that are being thrown at us. It more felt like I was just going on a fun ride. I highly recommend this book, and I can't wait to continue on with the series. Next up is Jim Butcher's Stormfront. This is book 1 in the Dresden files, and this is really a placeholder for the entire series. I haven't read all of the series, but I've read the first 6 or 7 books. They're just so fun. This is a fantasy series that is episodic. At least it's more episodic at the beginning, and then it starts to kind of weave some plot threads together in some of the later books that I've been reading. But it starts out very episodic. And so Harry Dresden is this wizard detective, and he gets cases from people that come to his office, and sometimes he gets cases from the police department in Chicago when they think there might be something magical going on. And this is a world where some people believe in the magic and the magical creatures, and some people don't. So it's not hidden necessarily, but it's also not like every person that Harry Dresden meets believes he is a wizard. There are some people believe, and some people think he is just weird and eccentric. I love the murder mystery format. I think Harry Dresden as a character is really fun to read about. There are like a couple male gaze issues in this story that I know has been a deal breaker for some people reading this book, so I want to give you a heads up that Harry Dresden does tend to objectify a lot of the women that he sees, but he has more nuance to his character. I wouldn't say he's like completely sexist and horrible the whole way through. But that is one aspect of his character. He will in his mind, in his internal monologue that we're reading, he's going to talk about women's bodies. So if that's a deal breaker, this series probably isn't for you. But for some reason, I don't know, it just doesn't bother me in this series. Every other part of it is so fun and so strong that I can look past Harry Dresden being a creep at times. Because the mysteries are so fun, and then the murders themselves are so gruesome that the horror reader part of me is like, ooh, this is cool, this is fun. And I'll just read out the little sign that Harry Dresden puts on his office so you can kind of get the vibe of the book. Harry Dresden, wizard. Lost items found, paranormal investigations, consulting advice, reasonable rates. No love potions, endless purses, or other entertainment. And so it's kind of a quirky book. It's dark at times. It's a character investigation of Harry Dresden as he goes on these adventures. And it's a murder mystery story. Like I said, do I think this is technically the strongest series ever? No. But do I think this is one of the most entertaining and fun series ever? Yes, and that's why it's on this list. Next up is the Poppy War trilogy. I read this whole trilogy last year, and this book made it to be my top book of 2022. The Poppy War series is one of my favorite trilogies of all time, and again, I mentioned I wasn't going to be rating this list, but if Mistborn is number 1, the Poppy War trilogy is probably number 2. It's so strong. It's so good. This is a historical fantasy series that is reimagining real Eastern Asian history. And we follow Rin, who is a peasant orphan living with her aunt's family, but they're horrible to her. And she knows that everyone can take this test. And if you score really well in this test, you will get invited to a military academy. And she hates her life currently. So she decides she is going to score well on this test and test into one of these military academies to escape her life. But she scores a little bit too well, and she gets placed at the top military academy ever. And suddenly, a peasant being there amongst the noble-born children, I mean, this is a huge scandal, and she is thrown into the deep end of this world of high-class politics, war, scholarship, and magic that she got a little bit more than she bargained for. But Rin is a badass character, and she is a morally gray character too. You're not going to agree with every decision she makes, but man, are you going to care about her? The Poppy War series is probably the darkest fantasy series I've ever read. Now, I want to put a little disclaimer. I haven't really read much grimdark fantasy, so I'm not saying this is the darkest fantasy out there, but in my experience with fantasy, this is dark. There are gory moments, and the thing about this series that makes it so hard to read at times is so many plot points of this book are inspired by real history. And honestly, in this book, there is a section that's one of the most horrific things I've ever read about, and it's based on real things that have happened in wartime. And so it's just, you need to know what you're getting into, and I want to put a big disclaimer. If you need to check trigger warnings, please check trigger warnings for this book, because there are many, many trigger warnings that exist. But in my opinion, R.F. Kuang goes over these experiences with a lot of care, with a lot of intelligence, with a lot of nuance. And I just think this book is a masterpiece, and I recommend the Poppy War series widely as well. So if you are a fantasy lover, or if you are not a fantasy lover, still try this book if you're okay with the dark content. Next up is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. I recently reread this book for a video where I kind of gave everyone a recap on this book for Hellbent. I'll leave that video linked below. That video is full of spoilers, so just FYI. But during that reread, I realized how much I love this book. Holy crap, this book is so good. I had such a good time with it. And I think it's so strong. So this is a urban fantasy story, dark academia story, where we follow our main character, I'm blanking on her name, Alex, who gets inducted into this magical secret society at Yale. And it becomes her job to make sure all of these other magical secret societies are following the rules. However, when her mentor goes missing, and a woman turns up murdered, it seems like there are some sketchy things happening behind the scenes, and she thinks some of the people in these magical societies might be committing murders. And I just think this is such a good book. The ghosts that are in this book are so scary, but also so fun to read about. Alex as a character is a brilliant character. I care deeply for Alex. And the rituals that the magical societies do are so dark and like gruesome and creepy and fun to read about. This book has some twists and turns that you will not see coming. This is such an enjoyable experience. It's a series. This is the first book in the series. I still have not read Hellbent, but spoiler alert for my April TBR, Hellbent is officially on it, so I will be reading Hellbent in April. But just from Ninth House, this is one of my favorite fantasy books of all time. And this is a hybrid genre where it's part fantasy, part horror. So I would recommend this book very widely as well. If you like horror books, try it. If you like fantasy books, try it. It's approachable fantasy because it's urban fantasy and dark academia fantasy. So it's something that will be easy to grab hold of. And then the last book series to talk about is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I have read all of the books that are currently out for this series, which is the first 4 books. I believe the series is going to be a 10-book series, so not yet completed, but I have read all 4 of them, and they are all masterpieces in my opinion. I did read them back to back though, so it's kind of like a weird fever dream. I can't really distinguish where one book stops and one book starts, and so I can't tell you what my favorite of the 4 books are. I can't tell you what my least favorite of the 4 books are. They just kind of all feel like one big book to me. But that series as a whole, I'm just holding up the first book here because it's the most recognizable. The series as a whole is so good. The mental health representation in this book in this series is really, really good. And I related to a lot of what some of the characters are struggling with in this series. And this is just such an epic fantasy series, but an epic fantasy series that doesn't feel overly convoluted or overly complicated. I liked all the different point of views we get. Of course, Cal is my favorite. Cal, I think, is everyone's favorite. But I really enjoy all the characters in this series. Like, I know a lot of people don't like Shallan. I love Shallan. I think she's really cool and fun to read about. So, like, that just gives you an idea that I think all the characters are so well done and complex enough where they all feel like real people. And I feel attached to all of them. And the friendships that happen along the way, the magic that is discovered along the way, the character arcs that we see happening. I love every part of this series. It feels like an epic event anytime I read something from this series. And I don't have a lot of experience with the more lengthy epic series. Like, I haven't read Wheel of Time. I'm making my way through Malazan, but I'm not experiencing the same love for it that everyone else has. I'm trying to think of other like long epic fantasy series. But basically, I feel like most of my adult epic fantasy experience is in duologies, trilogies, quartets, not necessarily these super lengthy series where we're getting very, very complex plots. This is a book series that makes me want to try out more of them because I love this so much. And while this plot does have a lot of complexities, like I said, none of it ever feels convoluted, and I always feel grounded in the story and know exactly what is going on. And so I love this series. Brandon Sanderson is my favorite author of all time. This is his second book series on this list, Mistborn being number 1. I really had to limit myself to not include Warbreaker and Elantris on this list too, but if I was extending the list more, Warbreaker and Elantris would also be on the list. I'm just a Brandon Sanderson stan, so of course The Way of Kings is epic and awesome. I do, before I end the series, want to talk about some honorable mentions that didn't make the list. I already mentioned Warbreaker and Elantris. Here they are. These are definitely honorable mentions for the list. Loved both of them so much. The Name of the Wind and A Touch of Light are definitely honorable mentions as well. This is a more recent read that is a new favorite, and this is one of the older reads, one of the first adult epic fantasy series that I read after Mistborn, and I really enjoyed it. Fair warning though, book 3 is not out in the series, and I'm not sure if it's ever gonna be out, so if you haven't read this, go in knowing you might be left with an uncompleted story, but I still love it for what it is. And then 3 more honorable mentions is V.E. Schwad's A Dark Shade of Magic series, Catherine Arden's The Bear and the Nightingale trilogy, and J. Kristoff's Nevernight trilogy. Okay, but that is all of my favorite fantasy books. I went over my top 10, and then I ended up including a bunch of honorable mentions because why not? Let me know down in the comments what your favorite fantasy books are because I'm always looking for more recommendations. And if you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you next time. Bye!